I was asked to place this in historical context. And so when we think about this effort by the current president with regard to birthright citizenship, it's not something that is isolated. It's connected to the long history in this country. And so when we think about this, at the founding of this country, who got to be full members of this political community? Now, the Constitution itself does not say anything about eligibility for citizenship. It does say something about naturalization. It directs Congress to create a uniform law of naturalization. So, what did Congress do when it used this power? In 1790, it created a law of naturalization that permitted free white persons to become naturalized. So, free white persons, that's what Congress did. From the beginning, it restricted who could be full members of this community. And then many people may be familiar with the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford. And this is a case in 1857. And the question was, and it's funny because it was actually a very technical question about whether or not a Black person could sue in federal district court. Because in order to sue in federal district court, he had to have been recognized as a citizen. And Chief Justice Roger Taney, in that opinion, said that Black people, regardless of how many generations they might have been free in this country, could never become citizens of this nation. And that actually precipitated a crisis that led to the Civil War. And then following that, there were attempts by Congress through the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, to address this. And so the 14th Amendment was intended to undo the harm of Dred Scott and this notion that Black people could be members, full members of this national community. Now, it did leave certain questions unanswered, including, okay, so now that Black people can be recognized as citizens, well, I guess we need to change our law of naturalization. And so Congress did that. And it allowed then white persons and persons of African nativity and descent to be naturalized. Well, okay, so what about people who look like me? What happens to people who look like me? Well, in 1882, in the Chinese Exclusion Act that forbid laborers from coming into this country from China, there was an explicit provision, I think Clause 14, that said that Chinese persons could not become naturalized. And so then, okay, so we can't become, people of Chinese ancestry can't become naturalized. What about their children? And that's when we get to the 1898 case that's been referred to of Wong Kim Ark versus the United States. So he is born in the United States. Is he a citizen? And the US Supreme Court in that decision said that yes, that was the interpretation of the 14th Amendment. He was born in the United States, subject to the jurisdiction, and therefore he's a US citizen. And since that time, and I don't have time to go through some of the other cases that confirm this, but we have an unbroken chain of 127 years of the recognition of birthright citizenship. But throughout this, there was still the effort to limit who could become citizens, because what about people who look like me? After this, could we become naturalized? And this is when, in 1922, the United States Supreme Court in Ozawa versus the United States said that a Japanese person could not become naturalized, even though he came to court and said, I'm white. He presented his skin to the court and said, I'm whiter than European immigrants that you let become naturalized. The US Supreme Court there said, well, white equals Caucasian, so therefore you lose. Well, the next year, a South Asian man came to the court and said, I'm Aryan, I'm Caucasian. You just said Caucasian equals white. I should be able to become naturalized. The US Supreme Court said no. White equals somebody who does not look like you. Now, has a devastating consequence, and this is critical in understanding a possible risk with regard to the current executive order. And so, following the denaturalization of Bhagat Singh Thind, the U.S. Department of Justice instituted denaturalization proceedings against the 60 to 70 South Asians who had been able to become naturalized. And so when we think about this executive order, sure, it said that babies born on February 19, 2025, and after do not have automatic birthright citizenship. But if the U.S. Supreme Court upholds this executive order, it creates the risk of the possibility that everybody who has parents in those two categories who thought they were US citizens, well, they could have the US government denaturalize them. And so that's one of the risks. And that's the argument that we made in the Ninth Circuit on the merits in an amicus brief. So the Korematsu Center, working with the Center for Civil Rights and Critical Justice at Seattle University, and with Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, we pose the risk because we know what history has produced for us. And so then when we think about what is really at stake, it also goes back to Cesar's point about voting. I think this has to do with undoing the voting rights of everybody retroactively who falls in these categories, because states are responsible for registering voters. And so if a state wants to act on the executive order, they could say, okay, well, if you want to vote, you have to prove that your parents don't fall into these two categories. And if you can't prove that, then you can't register to vote in that state. And so there's all sorts of mischief that might be produced. But again, getting back to the historical perspective, this has to do with controlling who gets to be full members in this community. And this goes to a long strand of history where people of color have been targeted, either in terms of not being able to become citizens by birth, or through naturalization, and this is just one step. If birthright citizenship goes away, well, who determines who can become naturalized? It's Congress. Okay, so it goes back to the political branches. Once this is restricted, it opens the door to other limitations in terms of who can become naturalized. The stakes in this are so great